Planting out tomatoes is probably the most nerve-wracking day of the entire gardening season. Really, you can spend weeks lovingly raising young plants on the windowsill, checking for new leaves every morning, turning the pots toward the light, watering them carefully, and imagining how the plants will later hang heavy with red fruit. But the exact day of transplanting often determines whether this vision will actually turn into a strong tomato plant later on, or just a weak bush struggling to survive all summer. Because at this moment, the safe life indoors ends, and real life begins. Many people completely underestimate how stressful transplanting actually is for a young tomato. Imagine the situation from the plant's perspective. For weeks it lived in stable warmth. No wind, no cold nights, even moisture. A small pot whose every inch its roots knew. And suddenly everything changes. New soil, different microorganisms, colder temperatures, strong sun, wind, fluctuating moisture. And right at this moment, the plant experiences something biologists call transplant shock. And honestly, this is exactly where the most important phase of the entire season begins. Because what goes into the planting hole often decides the future of the whole tomato, whether it will grow vigorously later, develop thick stems, and bear fruit well into the fall, or whether it will remain weak for weeks and never really get going. Over the years, I have watched countless gardeners debate almost passionately about what actually belongs in a good planting hole, and sometimes these conversations sounded almost like a religious war. One group said the plant needs everything immediately. The planting hole must be prepared richly and powerfully. The other replied, too much fertilizer makes the roots lazy. The plant has to look for food itself. Perhaps you have heard such discussions yourself. Some believe in heavy intervention, others in as little support as possible. And honestly, for a long time, I didn't know who was right either, because over many years I tried practically everything. Empty planting holes, large amounts of compost, mineral fertilizers, wood ash, manure, organic additives, mixtures based on old family recipes. And at some point, I understood something very important. The truth usually lies somewhere in between because young tomatoes need support, but they don't need an aggressive fertilizer bomb. That is exactly one of the most common mistakes modern hobby gardeners make. Many think exclusively of nutrients when it comes to the planting hole. Yet in the beginning, it's about something completely different: safety for the roots. Because right after transplanting, the tomato isn't particularly interested in fast growth or large fruit. First, the plant simply tries to survive. It has to form new roots, adapt to the soil, cope with the microorganisms, and withstand temperature fluctuations. And that is exactly why the first few days after planting are often more crucial than later fertilizer. In these first few hours, it is practically determined how resilient the plant will become, how quickly it will take root, how stably it will bear fruit later, and sometimes even how flavorful the fruit will be. And this is exactly where one thing comes in that I have been putting into practically every planting hole for years: wood ash. At first glance, it seems completely unspectacular. Gray dust, remnants of burned wood. Yet older gardeners often treated wood ash almost like medicine for the soil. And the longer I grow tomatoes, the better I understand why. Because ash is basically a natural source of minerals full of potassium and calcium. And these two substances are extremely important for young tomatoes. Potassium helps the plant regulate its water balance. When potassium is lacking, tomatoes react much more sensitively to heat, drought, and temperature fluctuations. The plants appear more unstable, limp, and prone to stress. But calcium is particularly interesting. Anyone who has ever grown tomatoes probably knows this frustrating sight. A beautiful fruit suddenly starts turning black at the bottom, dry, hard, rotten. The so-called blossom end rot. And many people only frantically try to counteract it when the damage is already visible. Experienced gardeners think differently. They try to prevent problems right at planting. That's why calcium goes into the planting hole right from the start. But ash does something else that is surprisingly rarely talked about. It affects the soil itself. Many garden soils become increasingly acidic over the years. Rain, fertilizer, intensive use. All of this slowly changes the chemical conditions in the soil. And this is exactly where a problem arises that many people don't even notice. Even if enough nutrients are present, the roots can sometimes barely absorb them. It's a bit like a refrigerator full of food behind a locked door. The nutrients are there, but the plant can't really get to them. And this is exactly where wood ash acts as a kind of natural regulator. It creates a more pleasant environment around the roots, less acidic, more stable, more balanced. And that helps young plants enormously. Interestingly, I have observed something else over the years. Where wood ash is used regularly, certain soil pests often appear much less frequently. Wireworms, for example, or larvae that damage young roots. It's not that ash acts like poison, but many of these organisms obviously don't particularly like the changed conditions around the roots. And right here I remember a gardening season a few years ago. At that time, I had a large tomato bed, and due to a lack of time, decided to plant a section without ash. After all, the soil looked good enough. The result was interesting. The plants without ash looked weaker right from the start. The leaves took on a slightly bluish tint. Growth was slower, and later that was exactly where the most problems with blossom end rot occurred. Since then, wood ash has practically been a standard part of the start for every tomato I grow. But here comes a very important point. Not every ash is suitable for the garden. I exclusively use ash from clean, untreated wood. No painted boards, no particle board, no burned trash, no chemically treated wood scraps. Only natural wood, birch, pine, aspen. And something else is important. The ash should never reach the roots directly as a concentrated layer. I always mix it carefully with soil. The roots should find a mineral-rich environment, not an aggressive layer of salt. And this brings us to a second substance that I have considered almost as important as wood ash for a strong start for years: phosphorus, or more precisely, superphosphate. And I know that some people immediately become skeptical about mineral fertilizers, but this isn't about indiscriminately overloading the plants with chemicals. It's about understanding how young roots work, because phosphorus is basically energy for the root system. Without it, many freshly planted tomatoes stand almost still for weeks, and that is exactly why experienced gardeners pay so much attention to ensuring that phosphorus is present exactly where new roots will form. For a long time, I honestly thought that superphosphate was probably overrated. You hear about it in garden centers for decades. So at some point, you automatically start believing that it's just some standard fertilizer you just add in. Only much later did I understand why experienced gardeners take phosphorus so seriously, especially when transplanting. Because phosphorus works completely differently from most fertilizers that people usually associate with fast growth. It doesn't cause giant leaves, not explosive green mass, not this artificially over-fertilized growth where plants suddenly become soft and unstable. Phosphorus works more quietly, deeper, more invisibly. But that is exactly why it is often so crucial in the beginning. Because right after transplanting, surprisingly little happens above ground. Many people look at the leaves daily and think the plant isn't growing at all. But underground, the real work is happening at this moment. The tomato is desperately trying to form new roots. It feels its way into unknown soil, looking for stable moisture, looking for warmth, looking for food, and this is exactly where phosphorus plays an enormous role. This became particularly clear to me one spring that was already pleasantly warm during the day, while the ground still cooled down significantly at night. A portion of my tomatoes got carefully prepared planting holes with wood ash, compost, and a little superphosphate. Another portion was planted in a rush. The difference was astonishing. The well-prepared plants started growing much earlier. The stems became thicker, the leaves darker, and above all, the plants seemed much calmer, almost as if they felt secure. The other tomatoes, on the other hand, stood practically still for almost 2 weeks in some cases. And it was exactly that year that I understood something important. A good start saves the plant an enormous amount of stress, and less stress usually means better resilience later on, more stable growth, stronger flowers, and often even more flavorful fruit. But here comes a point that an incredible number of beginners get wrong. More does not automatically mean better, especially with mineral fertilizers. Overdoing it can quickly become dangerous. Many people think that if a little helps, a lot will help even more. But plants don't work like machines. Too high concentrations of mineral fertilizers can literally burn young roots, especially right after transplanting. The tomato is already under stress, and then suddenly an aggressive salt concentration lands right in the root zone. The plant often reacts to this immediately. Growth stalls, leaves curl up, the tomato looks weakened or even sick. And many people don't even understand that the problem often starts right in the planting hole. That's why I have stuck to a very simple rule for years. Better a little too little than too much. Really, tomatoes often cope surprisingly well with minor deficiencies. With over-fertilized soil, however, they fare much worse. And that is exactly why a good planting hole isn't about pouring in as many additives as possible. It's about building a stable environment for the roots, almost like a small ecosystem. And this is exactly where we come to something that older gardeners often understood much better than modern hobby gardeners: living soil. Because many people today view soil almost exclusively as a carrier for fertilizer. Yet healthy soil is actually a giant living organism, full of bacteria, fungi, microorganisms, earthworms. Invisible processes are constantly taking place there. And that is exactly why good old compost used to be almost pricelessly valuable. Not fresh compost, not half-rotted garden waste, but dark, quiet, fully matured humus. When you pick up soil like that, you immediately notice the difference. The smell almost reminds you of a forest floor after rain. Warm, deep, alive. And that is exactly what makes good compost soil so special. It doesn't just contain nutrients, it brings life to the soil. And it is exactly this soil life that later begins to work together with the tomato roots. Today, many people try to supply plants exclusively from the outside. More fertilizer, more products, more additives. But experienced gardeners often try to make the soil itself healthy first, because healthy soil stabilizes many things all on its own. It retains moisture longer, it buffers temperature fluctuations, it supports the roots in absorbing nutrients, and that is exactly why tomatoes in truly living soil often look completely different. The stems become thicker, the leaves darker, the plants appear more stable and less stressed. And something else is interesting. Many people completely underestimate how much the taste of tomatoes depends on the soil. Not just on the variety, not just on the sun, but on the biological condition of the soil. Dead, depleted soil can keep a plant alive, but it rarely produces truly flavorful tomatoes. Perhaps that is exactly why many people say tomatoes used to taste more intense. Because in the past, gardens often worked with significantly more organic activity, more humus, more compost, more soil life. But right here, you have to understand something very important. Fresh organic matter is not the same as mature humus. And this is exactly where many people ruin their tomatoes. They see fresh manure or half-rotted material and think it must be particularly powerful. But this exact freshness can become a problem for young roots. Fresh manure releases aggressive nitrogen compounds and ammonia. This creates chemical stress around the roots that young tomatoes can often barely handle. The plants frequently look sick afterward. Leaves wilt, development stalls, strange discolorations appear, and many frantically start looking for fungal diseases or pests, even though the cause lies right under the plant. That's why I only use quiet, fully matured organic materials in the planting hole. Nothing that is still fermenting strongly, nothing that gets hot, nothing that smells aggressive, but soil that feels stable and alive. And this brings us to another point that many people completely underestimate: the temperature of the soil. Most people constantly look at the air temperature when gardening, but the roots live in a completely different world. It can be a sunny May day at 60 degrees, 20 grader so, while the soil a few inches deeper remains unpleasantly cold. And tomatoes don't like that at all. Cold roots work slowly, they absorb nutrients poorly, and they regenerate more slowly. The entire plant then seems almost indecisive, as if it isn't sure whether it should grow at all. Experienced gardeners, therefore, don't just look at the calendar. They observe the soil itself. They feel the soil with their hands, smell it, pay attention to moisture and structure, because living soil actually has its own character. And that is exactly why two seemingly similar gardens can yield completely different results, even if both plant the same tomato varieties. But now we come to an area that has probably been discussed the most in recent years: The strange additives in the planting hole. Fish, eggshells, banana peels, bread, yeast, nettles. And honestly, you sometimes really wonder where gardening practice ends and gardening magic begins. And this is exactly where the topic suddenly gets really exciting. Because as soon as you start looking more closely at gardening videos, forums, or old family methods, you quickly realize that almost everyone has some secret for perfect tomatoes. Some swear by fish scraps in the planting hole, others by eggshells, some bury banana peels, still others add bread, yeast, or fermented plant teas. And honestly, there is actually a biological thought behind many of these methods. The only problem is, on the internet, a reasonable idea often suddenly turns into a miracle cure. And that is exactly where misunderstandings begin. Take fish under tomatoes, for example. This method has been popping up again and again for decades, and it doesn't just come from some fantasy. In the past, many agricultural communities actually used fish scraps as fertilizer, especially in regions where other organic materials were scarce, because fish contains large amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace elements. Biologically speaking, the idea makes perfect sense, but modern hobby gardeners often forget a crucial point. In a small home garden, not everything works as smoothly as in old large-scale cultivation systems. Poorly buried fish scraps can quickly cause problems. Odor, rot, animals, overly aggressive decomposition right at the roots, and suddenly the secret trick becomes more of a problem than a help. That's why many experienced gardeners today view this method more as an interesting historical technique, not necessarily as an ideal solution for every bed. And right here, you realize something very important. Many old methods weren't stupid. They were often based on real observation of biological processes. But you have to understand when and why they work. Because a garden is no place for magic tricks. A garden is a living system. And that is exactly why balance is usually more important than individual spectacular additives. The same goes for eggshells. There is probably hardly a tomato tip that is repeated more often. Put eggshells in the planting hole to prevent blossom end rot. And fundamentally, it's true, of course. Eggshells contain calcium. The problem lies elsewhere. Many people throw large pieces of shell into the planting hole and expect an immediate effect. But this is exactly where an understanding of the speed of biological processes is often lacking. Large pieces of eggshell decompose extremely slowly, sometimes over several years. This means the tomato can often barely use the calcium it contains in the same season. Experienced gardeners who really use eggshells sensibly, therefore do something else. They grind them very finely. The smaller the particles, the faster soil organisms can break down the material. But even then, eggshells have more of a long-term effect on the soil, not like a quick, immediate helper. And this is exactly where many people confuse two completely different goals. One is the quick support of a freshly planted tomato. The other is the slow building of healthy soil over many years. That is not the same thing. It's a similar story with banana peels. On the internet, you constantly hear, bury banana peels and your tomatoes will get huge. This isn't completely based on nonsense either. Banana peels do indeed contain potassium. But again, the same question arises. How quickly does this potassium even become available? Fresh peels decompose comparatively slowly. Young tomatoes, however, need stable conditions immediately after planting. And that is exactly why well-matured compost, wood ash, and living soil usually work much more reliably, because they create a stable environment for the roots, and that is exactly what tomatoes respond to the most. But there is one organic additive that has personally really convinced me: nettles. And what's interesting here is that we are actually falling back on old gardening knowledge again. Young nettles contain enormous amounts of nitrogen and many trace elements. They decompose relatively quickly, they activate soil life, and many gardeners actually observe stronger plants and more intensely green leaves. But caution is important here too. Fresh nettles directly against sensitive young roots can be too aggressive. That's why they work much better if they are slightly pre-rotted, placed deeper, or worked in some time before planting. And this is exactly where we probably come to one of the most important rules of all gardening. Quantity and timing are crucial. That is what distinguishes living soil from chaotic experimenting. Because healthy soil doesn't work aggressively, not explosively, but quietly, stably, almost slowly. And honestly, that is exactly what still fascinates me the most about old gardening methods today. Earlier gardeners often didn't have shelves full of specialty products, no colorful advertising promises, no complicated fertilizing schedules. They really had to understand their soil. They observed plants, weather, moisture, soil structure, and perhaps that is exactly why their gardens often seem more alive than many modern high-performance beds. But now we come to a mistake that probably destroys more tomatoes than any nutrient deficiency: over-fertilization. Today, this is almost a fundamental problem in many hobby gardens. People are constantly afraid their plants might be missing something, and so something else is always added. Even more fertilizer, another product, another additive, another booster. But at some point, the system tips. The plants suddenly grow unnaturally soft, the leaves curl, the roots come under stress, or growth suddenly stops completely. And right here, you have to understand, roots can burn too. Salt concentrations in the soil that are too high act almost like dehydration for plants. The tomato suddenly has a harder time absorbing water, even though there is enough moisture present. That's why experienced gardeners often say something that initially surprises many beginners. A slight deficiency is usually less dangerous than an aggressive excess, because a stable plant can often compensate for small deficits surprisingly well. With constant chemical stress, however, it fares much worse. After all these years in the garden, I have therefore arrived at a surprisingly simple system, and honestly, I simplify my planting holes more and more with each passing year. Because a good planting hole should be one thing above all: quiet, alive, stable, not overloaded, not aggressive, not full of miracle ingredients, just well prepared. Today, I mostly use three basic variations. The first is a classic start: a little wood ash, a small amount of superphosphate, good compost soil, and surprisingly often, that is already completely sufficient. I use the second variation for particularly long and stable fruiting. Here, more mature organic matter is used deeper in the soil so that the soil life remains active all summer. And the third method is almost entirely organic: old humus soil, mature compost, ash, living microflora, patience. And the older I get, the more this last approach convinces me. Because with every year, I see more clearly that the best tomatoes often don't grow in the most heavily fed gardens, but where the earth is truly alive, where the soil is soft, moist, crumbly, full of earthworms, full of microorganisms, full of natural balance. Perhaps old gardens often tasted more intense exactly because people back then didn't try to artificially control every process. They rather helped nature do what it does best anyway. And honestly, I have the feeling that modern gardening is slowly returning exactly there. Be sure to write in the comments what you yourself put into the planting hole when planting tomatoes. Regional differences, in particular, are incredibly exciting. And if there are old gardening methods in your family that have worked for years, be sure to tell us about them. Such experiences are often more valuable than 1,000 advertising promises from the garden center. If this story has changed the way you look at the soil in your garden, then subscribe to our channel and give us a like. We dig up the history they tried to bury. Let's plant the future together. The next treasure trove of knowledge will soon be open for you.